This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Peter Bergen is an author and journalist, as well as the national security analyst for CNN. Early on in the Trump campaign and administration, President Trump sought to publicly associate himself with military generals. Peter Bergen wrote a book called Trump and His Generals about what happened when Trump actually got into office, started working with generals directly for the first time, and realized foreign and defense policy were perhaps more complicated than he initially thought. For the past 70 years at least, the United States has built strong alliances around the world in order to support our own security, prosperity, and economic competitiveness. Trump inherited these decades of work and put forward a brand of America first that put all of those alliances second. Now, in the aftermath of the Trump administration, America faces a world where our trust and influence are impacted by the actions and memory of Donald Trump's time in office. Given that Trump may run again in 2024, Peter recently updated his book, Trump and His Generals, to include even more information about what happened in the later years of the Trump administration, how it actually impacted the U.S.'s place in the world, and what that signals Trump might specifically do if he runs for president again in 2024. The re-released version, The Cost of Chaos, the Trump Administration and the World, is available now. To hear past episodes or sign up for our newsletter, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming this Monday. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led this interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
President Trump, even if he does, let's say he does get back in, and we're looking back at the national security figures he had around him in office. So I'm thinking Mattis, H.R. McMaster, John Kelly, who were considered the sane voices in the room, maybe even Rex Tillerson, depending on your views. Overall, despite having relatively conservative ideologies, where do you think these groups stood on U.S. foreign policy? Was it more in the mainstream, or was it more associated with Trump and his somewhat unorthodox views on how to approach it?
But by the end of year two, they'd all been forced out or resigned. And I do think that the reason that cliches exist is cliches sometimes basically capture the truth. And there was a sort of group of grown-ups in the room who had, whatever you think of Rex Tillerson, he had run ExxonMobil. And Jim Mattis, had obviously run Central Command, so he'd run the Iraq and the Afghan wars. H.R. McMaster had performed heroically in the Gulf War, first Gulf War and the Iraq War, won a Silver Star. His PhD became a best-selling book, Dereliction of Duty, about the Vietnam-era generals. This is a pretty formidable group of people who really understood how the national security apparatus of the United States works, which is something that Trump didn't understand at all. He's the first president in American history who hadn't served in public office or the military. Many of our presidents have served in both, and he served in neither. So he really had no idea what he was doing, or he had very little sense of. An opening scene in the book is a famous incident in the tank in the Pentagon where 6 months in, the grown-ups in the room try and explain to Trump kind of what the world looks like and why the United States is in these alliances and basically it was a total catastrophe, and Trump listened for a while and then sort of started screaming and shouting and sort of saying, this is exactly what I don't want. This book came out as Trump and His Generals. There's really a discussion of Trump and his generals in the first 2 years. I revised it and updated it for all sorts of reasons, not least that Trump really could become the nominee and really could become president. And so a reassessment of his record as commander-in-chief, I think, is an important one. And I think one area that he really was kind of unpredictable, not only did he force out of office or force them to resign or fire a lot of these generals, he also lost the support of the military, and I think in a very interesting way. And the moment he lost it was that June 1st photo op outside the White House in the wake of the George Floyd protests, because those protesters were violently cleared by local police, backed up by National Guard. And, General Milley was there in uniform, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Within 3 days, he publicly apologized in a graduation speech that he gave to National Defense University, saying, I shouldn't have been there. It was a mistake. He gave the wrong impression. Admiral Mike Mullen, who said nothing about Trump, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, came out with a very strong statement against Trump. John Dempsey, who was another chairman of the Joint Chiefs, never said anything publicly about Trump, came out. Colin Powell, who had criticized Trump, came out and sort of gave a blistering attack. And so at New America, I work at a think tank in DC where I thought it'd be interesting to track the statements of 3-star and 4-star officers, retired or active duty. And the reason we cut it off at 3 stars or 4 stars, in a way, if you retire as a 1-star, that's great, but you're not like the cream of the crop. Usually the 3 or 4 stars are very impressive human beings. And we found that of the 300 statements that have been made about Trump, 250 of them were critical. And many of them, were very critical after the incident at the White House, which was like a precursor of the incident on January 6th and the insurrection. Because then, and what was really interesting to me is not that this retired officers made these statements. Obviously, active duty officers, it's very difficult for them to critique the commander-in-chief directly. But the way they did it was pretty obvious in the sense they publicly said after the White House incident, we support the Constitution. And all the chiefs of all the services came out with very strong statements. And then after the January 6th insurrection, General Milley released an extraordinary letter to the 2 million men and women of the armed services, National Guards, active duty, and reserve, saying President Joe Biden is going to become the 46th president of the United States. And this sort of act of sedition or insurrection is not something so the military made it very clear that they were not going to go along with this. That's great. I mean, we're not Turkey, or we're not Pakistan, or some other countries where the military can really intervene in politics and change the situation.
So, Peter, I was actually at those protests. We didn't know why that was happening. They were George Floyd protests against police brutality. I think President Trump took them rather personally. And like you said, he violently cleared everybody out for a photo op with the Bible. But we've also heard, you just mentioned all the 3 and 4-star and really senior military officials come out against that type of authoritarianism or those type of actions in favor of the Constitution, but also in the mainstream news, and I think it's accurately reported, there's a significant chunk of the military that do support Trump, despite these authoritarian tendencies. The senior ones like Mike Flynn and the lieutenant colonels like Mastriano running in Pennsylvania. My question to you is, do we have anything to be concerned about within our military? Because it seems like the senior folks are all stable institutionalists for the Constitution, but maybe more in the junior ranks, they're more pro-Trump, maybe even pro-authoritarian. How can we square these two things? And do you think there's a real threat there?
Well, I think 2 points. One, the military is a reflection of American society. And the fact that American society is polarized, therefore it's not surprising that there would be polarized views in the military. The military is very popular in the United States precisely because it doesn't take political positions. And let's do the thought experiment where Kamala Harris is president and a bunch of 3 stars and 4 stars started critiquing for whatever reason. I mean, so I think a broader point is we're a polarized society. The military reflects that. But while you may agree with General Milley coming out with a statement saying President Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States, that's all great. But obviously I support that, and I presume lots of people support that. And it was the right thing to do. However, we're getting in a strange situation where, because if you go back to the Bill Clinton presidency, Admiral Crowe was a retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he endorsed Clinton. At the time, that was regarded as very, very, very unusual. And now, when the Republicans and the Democrats come up with a candidate, you have hundreds and hundreds of retired officers at the 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, even 4-star retired, sort of endorsing either candidate. And that's a slippery slope for the U.S. military, because the reason the U.S. military, one of the reasons is, amongst others, is held in such regard is precisely because it is regarded as being apolitical. So I think that it's just something to think about, because it does represent a kind of a relatively new phenomenon. You mentioned Mike Flynn. Okay, so we all remember Mike Flynn spoke at the Trump convention, led the chants of lock her up about Hillary Clinton. Also, but speaking of the Hillary Clinton convention, was retired 4-star Marine General John Allen, who's a very impressive guy who's running the Brookings Institution now. But he gave a stem-winding speech in favor of Hillary Clinton. And so, leaving aside the politics of who you support or who you don't support, I mean, is this a good development in American political life? Is, I think, a reasonable question to be asking.
Well, I think that kind of brings us back to the whole theme of the book, Peter, which was Trump and his generals, the original title. And I mean, what was strange about the way that Trump staffed the administration was that he put these generals in key decision-making positions that were inherently political. And just like you said, with the tradition of military nonpartisanship or military non-intervention into
Yeah,
politics.
that's such an interesting question. And, because like Trump wanted them to be very political, and these were really apolitical guys. I think John Kelly, who was his chief of staff, at one point said, look, if Hillary Clinton had asked me to be her chief of staff or serve for her, I would have said yes. I mean, I think he really meant that. John Kelly had never met Trump when he was offered the job. He didn't know anybody who knew Trump. I mean, they were coming from different universes. And so I think H.R. McMaster was in a particularly tricky situation because H.R. was still in uniform, so he was active duty. So Trump was his commander-in-chief. If Trump asked him to do something, it was almost akin to a military order. Trump wanted H.R. to be on television defending him, and I think his national security advisor, he probably did that a few times. But that was not how he saw his role. And Mattis, I think, never appeared on television on the Sunday shows. And so I think you put it's a really interesting question because I think there's a real point of tension between everybody because, Trump wanted them to be ultra political. They themselves saw themselves as apolitical. But if you get a job as, let's say, the national security advisor in any administration, it's going to be a somewhat political job because occasionally you're going to have to get out there and defend policies, even if you don't necessarily particularly endorse them yourself. I mean, that it's a political appointment. So, it's tricky, but it all came apart. I mean, why did Trump put all these people in these positions in the first place? First of all, he had a childish fascination with military parades. He went to a military-style boarding school. His heroes are General Patton and General MacArthur. Interesting data point, the last time that protesters had been violently cleared from outside the White House was during the Hooverville kind of protests, and it was MacArthur who led the charge to get rid of those protesters. But he's always had this fascination with the Pattons, the MacArthurs, the military in general. He wanted to have this huge parade in Washington, which in the end didn't really happen. And also he needed people who actually understood he had no idea about, how national security is made or foreign policy, very, very kind of cartoonish views about a bunch of things. And so he needed these experts. But over time, I think, they all ran afoul of him for one reason or another. HR put up a big fight on the Afghan issue, which I think really kind of undercut himself politically. He really stood up for, we need to stay. And, we need to kind of stay and stay, we're staying. And he lost a lot of altitude defending that position. Trump eventually basically sort of forced him out. And then, of course, Mattis resigned because of Syria policy, although that was really the occasion, not the cause. Mattis has said publicly that the most successful alliance in modern history is NATO. And, I think there's a very good argument we were seeing it playing out right now. And here's a guy who, one of the scenes in the book, one of my favorite scenes is Trump really misunderstood how NATO works. He either chose to misunderstand or did misunderstand. So he was always very angry that the Germans were only paying 1.4% of GDP when everybody in NATO has agreed to spend 2% of GDP, which now the Germans are going to do. But Obama was also trying to get them to everybody. For some reason, Trump interpreted that the Germans were actually ripping off the United States. And so when Angela Merkel came for her first trip to Washington, he presented an invoice to her, which she didn't accept, for $600 billion, which was his calculation of how much the Germans owed the United States because they hadn't been paying 2% of GDP into their own self-defense. That is not the way NATO works. The United States spends a relatively small amount of money just to have NATO run as an organization, and then everybody has an agreement to spend a certain amount of money on their own defense, which is a collective self-defense if anybody's attacked. So, we know from John Bolton that he was constantly saying we'll pull out of NATO. Imagine where we would be today if that was the case. I mean, it would be. And he was constantly, of course, essentially doing Putin's bidding for reasons that still remain obscure in terms of undercutting NATO, in terms of embracing Putin, in terms of, and it's an interesting question, how would have our Ukraine policy been different if Trump had been in office? I mean, you got to presume it would have been slightly different.
But we did get to see how he handled the Ukraine issue while the war was going on, because the war didn't just start on February 24th.
That's
it started in 2014.
Yeah. That's a very good point. So,
yeah, he had no problem extorting Zelensky, right?
Yeah, exactly. He saw that the arms transfers that we were doing to support the Ukrainian effort were a political tool that could be used for his own domestic purposes. And that was generally the basis of much of his decision making. But much of what you said, I hope that we can get into more detail about. I'd love to talk about some of these areas of disagreement with the generals that you acknowledge around NATO, around Syria, around the Middle East. But just kind of going back, we were talking about how Trump loved the generals, so he loved the idea of the generals. But I think it wasn't really the generals as people that he admired and loved. It wasn't the real Patton or the real MacArthur or the real Mattis. It was the Hollywood version of what a general was. It was George C. Scott as Patton. It wasn't the real man Patton, who read books, who had interests and tastes. It was the hard-driving cartoon that you saw on television. And I think that really it's what you've identified from the beginning, which is Trump's lack of experience actually working with the military and actually engaging with high-ranking generals in the U.S. military and understanding who they are, what their interests are, what sort of people they really are. And he was disappointed by the reality is that these were people who had the values of the United States. They didn't have the values of Hollywood warmongers.
Right. And, I begin, there's an epigram in the book, which I would like to read because I think Neil Postman wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985. And I think he really got something so right about us, the United States. Our politics, religion, news have been transformed into congenial adjuncts of show business, largely without protest or even much popular notice. The result is that we are a people on the verge of amusing ourselves to death. And he wrote that in 1985, and I think that was, unfortunately, got us really right. And, Trump was, I think that's an interesting observation. I mean, it wasn't a Patton of history. It was more the George C. Scott playing Patton that was particularly interesting to Trump because that's the way he sort of interpreted the world. He famously said, I think Chuck Todd or Tim Russ had asked him at one point, I think it must have been Chuck Todd saying, where do you get your foreign policy tips or for foreign policy advice? And he's like, well, from watching the shows. I think what he meant, like watching people on TV pontificate. And, actually, there was a very interesting set of observations about that. So General Jack Keane, who was a former Army Vice Chief of Staff, I think acted almost like a national security advisor. He's on Fox a lot. He's a very bright and impressive human being. His views tend to be on the interventionist side. And he was one of the few people that Trump really treated as a peer. And Keane could go into the Oval Office and talk to Trump and get him to change his mind about things he'd already. So like when Trump said we're going to pull all the troops out of Syria, Keane was able to go in and say, look, I mean, let's keep a few hundred troops because that keeps the Iranians at bay, keeps ISIS at bay, prevents the gas fields in Syria from falling into Iranian hands, etc. And he persuaded Trump to change his mind. But he did that, I think, by being on Fox News, by saying these things on Fox News, and then, occasionally going into the Oval Office. And so Trump, he didn't really absorb written documents. Going back to the kind of the new version of the book, I call him the least competent president in American history. That's my conclusion. I think there are three buckets for that. One, before I get to those buckets, let's say, what did he get right? He got ISIS right. He took the Obama plan, amped it up. They were defeated. Abu Bakr Baghdadi was killed in an operation that he ordered. He got China right, not maybe on the trade stuff, but certainly on their aspirations. And there was a lot of wishful thinking about the Chinese, which is as they liberalize economically, they'll liberalize politically. And of course, that didn't happen. The reverse happened. And he also got Operation Warp Speed right, which is put a lot of money into Moderna, $2.5 billion. Didn't put money into Pfizer, but ordered $2 billion of Pfizer vaccine. So it's actually created a market for Pfizer, so they had a guaranteed market. So those are the things he got right. But then he got a bunch of things really wrong, and I think they go into three buckets. One is the election denialism, which no president in history has consistently and publicly said that they didn't lose an election that any outside observer would say, yeah, you lost. That has really poisoned American politics, and also it set himself up in 2024 potentially should he run and should he not win again? I mean, unfortunately, that will create a lot of disharmony in this country. So, and then point two, his response to COVID, I think, played to all his weaknesses. When I completed the hardcover of this book towards the end of 2019, I said, Trump's been really lucky. Every president going back to FDR has had some major foreign policy crisis or crisis blow up on their watch. The financial meltdown for Obama, the 9/11 for George W. Bush, World War II for FDR, Truman facing the end of World War II, and the beginning of the Cold War. The list goes on. And Trump really had nothing. And then COVID happened. And he was supremely unprepared for that for three reasons. Trump never does any homework. He doesn't listen to experts. And he trusts his gut. And that might work for a Manhattan real estate deal, but it doesn't work for a complex public health crisis. And it didn't. And so, we all know the denialism, the inaccuracies, the bleach, the hydroxychloroquine, we'll be getting together for Easter, the kind of long litany of things he said publicly, which had major health impacts. Particularly before vaccinations, there was only two ways to deal with the virus: social distancing and masks. He denigrated wearing masks. He almost never wore one. He had big public events at the White House with people unmasked. For instance, Amy Coney Barrett's celebration for the Supreme Court elevation. And Deborah Burke testified to a congressional committee that 30 to 40% of the deaths during the Trump administration were avoidable because of Trump administration policies, which he is responsible for. And the first duty of a commander-in-chief is the protection of American citizens.
So, Peter, you're listing off all of these awful things that President Trump did, right? And I agree, right? I left the Republican Party before he got into office because I was worried about it. And that's not a small feat for somebody starting their career, right? Because you burn down your bridge and then it's tough to get in the other party. But I got to ask, put the cable news networks aside that are literally employing some of the communication staff of Trump that are responsible for the first bucket, the big lie, which I think is deplorable and a true disservice to democracy. You had other people in the administration in serious positions, so not communications, but in national security positions, in State Department positions, who made the argument, I don't like Trump, but I'm a serious person. I'm going to stay in the administration because I'm going to prevent bad from happening. And I'm a natural cynic, and I have to ask you, in your conversations with these people, in your research, did you find any concrete examples of person A, B, and C staying in the administration and actually preventing a catastrophe from happening? Or was that maybe part of their own bargaining with themselves to just stay close to power, stay in the DC game, and be in it?
I have some ideas, but I also... it's hard to talk about things that didn't happen, right? So as a result of people taking certain actions because things didn't happen, and therefore there's kind of a philosophical problem with trying to answer that question to some degree. But certainly Mattis thought that it was much of the annoyance of the White House, he would always slow roll military options being presented to the president on Syria, on Iran, on North Korea. The White House and H.R. McMaster, who was the national security advisor, was asking for serious military options. And so there was a certain amount of tension between H.R. McMaster and Mattis. But then you asked this question about bargaining. Look, we're all bargaining with each other all the time about various things. And I don't think that's completely... a lot of people who are in the Trump administration, Deborah Birx, I've just mentioned her, Mark Esper, Jim Mattis, John Kelly. I mean, I think a lot of them have publicly said that they felt that a big part of their role was just to kind of keep the train. I basically think that that's probably true for a lot of these people because they could have gone and done anything else and they'd have pretty senior jobs in other administrations or other situations. And so I take a lot of that at face value for some of the people we just discussed. But John, you were going to say.
Well, Justin was asking if any of these officials who stayed in the administration saying that they were containing the excesses of Trump had succeeded in preventing any catastrophes. And I think there's one period that you mentioned in the book, and that's, again, about the blockade of Qatar. And, I'm coming back to this issue because it was something that did affect me personally. I was living in the UAE at the time, and I had family living in Qatar. And so we were on either side of the blockade line, and I wasn't able to easily visit my family without flying to a third country, which I did end up doing a couple times, going to Ethiopia just so I could take that, what would ordinarily be a 45-minute flight.
You'd have to sort of fly all around the Middle East to kind of be able to visit.
Yeah, instead of taking a 30-minute flight, I had to fly to Addis Ababa and then go to Qatar, which was extraordinary and ridiculous. But in the book, Peter, you talk about how after Trump and Kushner appeared to give the blessing to this blockade, Mattis and Tillerson worked to try to shore up Qatar and protect them. And Mattis made efforts to carry on with weapons transfers that were going to happen. Tillerson was on the phone doing shuttle diplomacy. And you raised the possibility in this chapter in the book that if not for these efforts, it's possible that Saudi Arabia and the UAE would have taken the blockade even further and invaded the country. And, this is an extraordinary possibility to me because, again, it would have had an incredible impact on my life. And so I'm wondering, Peter, how close do we get to this happening? And is this a case where we can say that Mattis and Tillerson did prevent a catastrophe?
The Qataris really believe that the Saudis were planning to invade. That's their strong belief. It's hard for me to know. I mean, clearly Trump had no idea that the Qataris, sit on one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. He had no idea that there were 10,000 American servicemen. The reason we have a base in Qatar is because we were thrown out of Saudi Arabia because of all the sort of tensions that bin Laden was kind of an exemplar because of our presence in Saudi Arabia. So the Qataris were a very close ally and a very natural ally of the United States. And you look at them right now, I mean, they're our intermediaries with the Taliban to a large degree. And so I think the Qataris really felt that the Saudis were planning to invade. And Tillerson and Mattis were in Australia on a trip when they found out about the blockade, and they were both very deeply surprised because Mattis had run CENTCOM. Well, as you know, the forward component of CENTCOM is in Qatar, at the Al Ubaid Air Force Base. And Mattis had negotiated the natural gas deal with Exxon. He'd known the Emir of Qatar since he was 14, I think. So they knew exactly that this made no sense. And the other thing about it was like the whole premise was that Qatar somehow a friendly state to terrorists, and none of it really made any sense. I think it also goes to the immaturity of the Trump administration at the time, that they knew very little about it. The foreign policy in that area was, to a large degree, being driven by Jared and his relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. So it will be very interesting when Joe Biden goes to Saudi and see what his reception is. I thought it was, by the way, rather telling that when Jake Sullivan went to Saudi to meet with MBS met him in shorts. For anybody who's been to Saudi Arabia, to go to a meeting with somebody in shorts, this is not a sign of respect. This is an intentional diss.
Well, I think that when Saad Hariri was taken prisoner in the KSA, he was wearing shorts. They said they were going on a desert drive. And then the picture of Sheikh Tahnoon and MBS with the Qatari emissary, when they finally patched things up, they're all wearing shorts in that photo. So maybe it's the new era of shorts diplomacy.
Oh, maybe it is. And it's people, Riyadh apparently...
This is the new Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia. No more abayas and kandoras.
Well, and I think that is really a big change. I mean, that's the interesting thing, of course, is that Riyadh is apparently, couples are holding hands, and MBS has done some things that we have always wanted, which is, put the religious police back in their barracks. And, I think MBS would recognize Israel tomorrow if his father wasn't alive, who feels very strongly about the Palestinian issue. MBS, could care less as far as I can tell. And I think Israel will have overflight rights over Saudi Arabia. It won't get recognition because that would be a bridge too far. But clearly, we're in a whole different place.
I just want to jump in because you brought up Israel and the accomplishments that you listed off. I didn't hear the Abraham Accords. And that's like a hotly debated thing, right, Peter?
Well,
Aaron David Miller extols the virtues of them to us.
Well, Aaron David Miller knows more about it by orders of magnitude than I do, and he's an extraordinarily smart, brilliant guy. It depends on what you think the Abraham Accords are supposed to do. If the Abraham Accords were supposed to somehow produce a deal that would give Palestinians some kind of quasi-statelet and some rights and all that, it failed completely. Let's go back to the theory of the case of the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were like, okay, Israel makes peace with Bahrain, other Arab states, UAE. They begin to invest a lot of money in the Palestinian territories, and the United States puts in tens of billions of dollars as well, because it's at one point, Mnuchin said it was a hot IPO. The West Bank was going to be a hot IPO, which is I don't think that really worked out well. But the idea was there'd be tens of billions of dollars investments from the Arab states, and there would be matching investments from the United States, that would all bring the Palestinians to the table, that they would be much more amenable to a deal, because the stated point at the beginning was that then the Israelis and the Palestinians would finally come to some accommodation. Well, there was that, several days of riots in Gaza in which 12 Israelis were killed, and I think something like 200 plus Palestinians were killed, and peace has not come. So I don't mention the Abraham Accords because I think maybe all along it wasn't intended to be anything other than what it is, which was a sort of de facto recognition of an emerging alliance between Israel and a number of the Arab states, particularly Gulf monarchies, because of their a collective fear of Iran. So it is an achievement on a certain level, but it's certainly not an achievement in terms of what it was supposed to do, which was really bring Israel and the Palestinians to some sort of deal. And on that, it failed completely.
I think also if we look at some of what Kushner and the U.S. gave to these Arabic-speaking countries in exchange for recognition, you can see ripple effects that are not entirely positive. I mean, with the UAE, there's the F-35 deal, which has created all kinds of problems. And then in North Africa, the recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara has led to the rupture of diplomatic relations between Morocco and Algeria, and even some concern of armed war emerging between those two countries. And I think, Peter, this kind of what it brings us back to is one of the real problems with the way, from my perspective, the Trump administration engaged with the Middle East was that any sense of normalcy and shape of what was possible in the relationship went away. So we talked about how the U.S. allowed Saudi Arabia's excesses with the Qatar blockade, also with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. But then at the same time, when the Saudi oil fields were attacked, likely by Iran, when Houthi missiles were raining into Saudi territory, the U.S. didn't really seem to be acting to defend them. So I think that the idea of where do we stand really just, it became impossible to answer. People like Mattis, who love the Arab countries, who have spoken so positively about Saudi Arabia, who called the UAE Little Sparta, who have real affection and shared interest with these countries, wanted there to be more guardrails and a sense of what we would and wouldn't do in our relationship. And even though the Trump administration seemed at the highest levels like they wanted to give all these incredible gifts, they've upset the relationship and put it in this really uncertain, very unstable place, right?
Well, but I don't think that's peculiar to the Trump administration. The Trump administration negotiated the deal with the Taliban for the U.S. to withdraw, and the Biden administration went through with it. Turned out to be a total disaster, and we abandoned our Afghan allies, 40 million of them, to the fate of the Taliban. So I don't think the U.S. has a reputation, particularly in the greater Middle East, as sort of sticking to its guns. I mean, there's changes of administration mean change of policy. It might be a bit different with our NATO allies. President Trump was certainly very denigratory of NATO, but that was kind of an outlier. Mention of Afghanistan, there was one other bucket of issues that I wanted to touch on, which I think kind of add to this question of how Trump was the commander-in-chief. And he came into office saying he was going to do all these great deals. Well, the Afghan deal is probably the worst deal in American diplomatic history. It makes Neville Chamberlain look like Metternich, as far as I'm concerned, which is we gave the Taliban everything they wanted and we got nothing in return. I mean, they said they were going to split with al-Qaeda. Well, the UN issued a report last week, which was put out on a Friday night at 7 p.m., which is a pretty good time to bury a report on a Memorial Day weekend. But the report is very good, and it's definitely everybody who's interested in this subject should look at it. And then the report concludes that al-Qaeda and the Taliban are very close, and al-Qaeda has more freedom of movement. And it says that 41 of the top Taliban cabinet officials and senior officials are UN sanctioned. There's no government in the world that has so many. And so the Trump team put that in progress. The agreement, Joe Biden, I think, made a mistake by saying he needed to stick by the agreement, and then it was very poorly executed, the withdrawal. But, I think that this was, Trump said he was a great deal maker. This was a terrible deal. And then on North Korea, he was going to charm Kim Jong-un, met with him 3 times, exchanged 27 letters. Some of them were like love letters, according to Trump. Got nothing. The North Korean program, they continued testing ballistic missiles. And then similarly with the Iran deal, by pulling out, we just had the report from the UN Atomic Inspection Agency saying that the Iranians almost certainly have enough nuclear material for a nuclear weapon. Well, that was not true when we did the deal with the Iranians in 2015. The Obama administration did that deal with the Germans, French, and British, our closest allies. The Iranians were sticking to the deal, according to Trump's own intelligence agencies, unlike the Taliban deal, which was with a terrorist insurgent group and didn't even include the Afghan government. This deal was done with our closest allies. The Iranians were sticking with it. The Trump administration pulled out, and the Iranians are in a much better place with their nuclear program than they were when we had the deal in place. So I think that the other bucket of issues is he made terrible deals on the Afghan front, on the North Korean front, and on the Iranian front. And going back to your point about, Justin, about the Abraham Accords, look, I mean, there are elements of that which are good, but it doesn't really solve the underlying problem which it was supposed to solve, which is the low-level kind of conflict that continues to go on between the Palestinians and the Israelis on a day-to-day basis.
So, Peter, we've gone through a lot of the big decisions that happened throughout the Trump administration. And one of the reasons that you re-released the book under the new title, The Cost of Chaos, was to update it and gather some more material about what happened at the very end of the administration. And one of the most unanswered and fascinating questions about Trump's relationship with the Pentagon and the military comes right at the very end. And that's what exactly was happening at the Pentagon around the time of January 6th. So after Trump lost the election, there was a purge of all the top civilian offices at the Pentagon. Esper and his team left, and they were replaced by a group of people who did not have a sterling reputation in Washington, people like Kash Patel and others. And for a long time, this has been a very unclear aspect of the story around January 6th. We're wondering, there's an outgoing administration, it's only a few more weeks in office. Why put all of these figures into these top positions? What was the plan? What were they there to do? And there's been different answers to the question. Some of the people involved have said it was because they were trying to expedite the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We also know that Ezra Cohen did a whole review of how security clearances work that was actually widely praised. But at the same time, the connection to January 6th is a very curious one. So I'm wondering, Peter, do you have anything to say about this because you've researched the Pentagon, the military, and the relationship with Trump?
On the January 6th question, look, I mean, I think that there's a vast investigation that's going to have answers that really will answer. And I think there was a reasonable kind of position, like we don't want National Guard armed outside the U.S. Capitol in the context of what many assumed would be a peaceful protest or no protest at all. I mean, it wasn't clear that the mob would be incited by the president and his sort of acolytes and that they would storm the Capitol, although there might have been some sort of intelligence that the violence was going to happen. But the point is that in the context of all the protests that had happened and the White House protests that we just discussed, there was a pretty good reason to say maybe we shouldn't have the National Guard armed outside the Capitol in this context. So, and then on the question of these people that were brought in, like Patel, and there was also Douglas McGregor, who's a retired lieutenant colonel, PhD, very bright guy, Fox talking head. At one point, Trump thought he might be a good national security advisor. He was brought in as well. And I think you mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think part of his brief, because he's always been very public, was to try and get out of Afghanistan before the end of the Trump term. So I think there was some effort to kind of send in some very highly politicized folks to kind of fulfill Trump's promises to get out of Afghanistan. I think that was definitely part of it.
Yeah, I know that Anthony Tata, who was another one of those individuals, was considered so extreme that Jim Inhofe wouldn't give him a vote in the Armed Services Committee.
Well, Inhofe is conservative, but I've worked with him a lot when I was a lobbyist, and he is principled. But McGregor, that you mentioned, Peter, he's Putin's mouthpiece on Tucker Carlson's show now.
Oh, I didn't know that. He's sort of an odd duck. He has these very robust kind of isolationist views after Bolton was forced out. Trump was seriously considering him, making him national security advisor. In the end, he chose this guy, Robert O'Brien, who had been the hostage negotiator at the State Department.
Another polarizing figure, too.
Well, I mean, look, the interesting thing about these guys is that, and they were mostly guys, is that in a normal administration, he would never have become national security advisor. I mean, Mark Esper, who seems like a very a decent human being and smart, he would have been like a assistant secretary of X in DOD, right? In a normal administration, he would never. And Chris Miller, who I know, served very honorably in Afghanistan, special operations colonel, senior job at the White House in counterterrorism, ran National Counterterrorism Center. I mean, he was very surprised when he was appointed acting Secretary of Defense for the last, I think, 31 days or whatever of the Trump administration. I think he saluted and just said, yep, and I'll take the gig. So, but it was at the end, and this is actually interesting, if Trump were to win again, or even to run again, I mean, who would be part of that team? And who would Mike Flynn come back as an important person on the campaign? My guess is yes.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Peter Bergen and CNN. His re-released book, The Cost of Chaos, the Trump Administration and the World, is available now. To hear past episodes or sign up for our newsletter, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming on Monday. This has been Politics and Media 101. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founders, Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, we hope to hear from you soon.